They were trusted with saving lives. Instead, they took them. From the man who killed over 100 people with what he called his mercy machine, to a real-life monster whose favorite book was The Torture Doctor. And then there's the British man who could be the most prolific serial killer ever known. These doctors broke their oath and turned medicine into murder. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're revealing the most dangerous doctors in history. Number 10. Novelist Charles Dickens once called Dr. William Palmer the greatest villain that ever stood in the Old Bailey. Others knew him as the Prince of Poisoners. Palmer had all the traits of a psychopath. He started crime young, losing a job as a trainee chemist in Liverpool when he was caught stealing. He later became a practicing physician in London before returning to his hometown in quiet Staffordshire. The first suspected victim was a friend who had beaten him in a drinking contest at a local pub. The man returned home and died in agony. Palmer the Poisoner was just getting started. After setting up his own practice, he married Anne in 1847. She came from money. Her mother, also named Anne, had inherited a fortune of around $8,000, over $1 million in today's money. 15 months later, the elder Anne was dead. The coroner called it natural causes. Palmer was now wealthy, but he wanted more. In 1850, he went to the horse races with a friend who struck it lucky and pocketed a handsome sum. Days later, that friend was found dead in Palmer's house, having writhed in agony as Palmer watched. His betting book, the record of his winnings, had conveniently vanished. Another case of natural causes, according to the coroner. During this time, Palmer and Anne had 5 children. 4 never made it out of infancy, all written off as convulsions. Anne was devastated. For Palmer, it simply meant fewer mouths to feed. But his debts were mounting. He forged his mother's signature to get his creditors to back off, but it wasn't enough. In 1854, he insured Anne's life. Months later, she was dead at just 27. The official cause was cholera. Next, Palmer turned to his brother Walter, a man who liked to drink. Ever the good brother, Palmer always kept his glass full. He also helped Walter secure a life insurance policy. At that same time, Palmer was having an affair with his housemaid and had fathered a child with her. It was another expense that he didn't want to cover. Money was tight, but when Walter died, it should have been another payday. This time, though, the insurance company smelled a rat and refused to pay out. Then came 1855, and Palmer lost badly at the races, but his friend John Cook won big, £3,000, a fortune at the time. The two men celebrated at a pub. Cook raised his glass, but suddenly cried out that his gin burned his throat. Moments later, he collapsed in agony. Cook grew suspicious. "I believe Palmer has been dosing me." Still, he made the fatal mistake of remaining friends with Palmer. He even allowed him to treat him since he never fully recovered from the gin incident at the pub. Soon after, he died with Palmer at his bedside. His money, his betting books were all gone. Despite Palmer trying to bribe the coroner, the inquest results stated deceased died of poison willfully administered to him by William Palmer. The subsequent investigation revealed Palmer's choice of poison was strychnine, and he'd likely been killing for years. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On June 14, 1856, with 30,000 people in attendance, he walked onto the scaffold, his eyes fixed on the trapdoor, before uttering, "Are you sure it's safe?" Now let's take a look at when the doctors fake it. Number 9. Christopher Duntsch, otherwise known as Dr. Death, was not the kind of guy you'd want as your surgeon. Like many psychopaths in this world, he had what you could call the gift of gab. His CV was a litany of successes, full of high-performance adjectives that all go with the 5-star reviews of his excellent surgeries. Except it was all a lie. His colleagues said his handiwork looked less like surgery and more like butchery, yet the hospitals where he worked didn't always pay attention. In just 2 years, this cocaine-snorting, pill-popping maniac operated on 38 patients, 2 died on the table, dozens more woke in agony. One of those deaths, a schoolteacher, had gone in for a relatively simple procedure, and Duntsch effectively murdered her. Why wasn't he stopped? The answer is money. A spinal surgeon can earn a hospital millions, but a bad one can cost them millions in lawsuits. So when Duntsch's carnage became obvious, the hospitals did the easy thing. They quietly let him move on. He didn't even lose his license. He kept maiming patients for months before it was finally revoked. His trail of devastation reads like something out of a horror novel. In one surgery, he mistook neck muscles for a tumor. The patient left with slashed vocal cords, a punctured artery, a hole in his esophagus, and, because Duntsch forgot the basics, a surgical sponge sewn in him. The patient spent days in intensive care, months in rehab, and still lives with permanent nerve damage and has difficulty eating. So how could this happen? Part of the answer lies in who Duntsch was. He'd been the guy at school who bragged that he was destined for greatness. When football stardom didn't pan out, he turned to medicine hoping for the same spotlight, but he never put in the hours. He preferred cocaine to care. While a neurosurgery resident could perform around 1,000 operations, Duntsch somehow scraped by with only about 100. He had all the letters, an MD and a PhD, but his focus was on biotech ventures and drug binges, not honoring his surgical skills. Still, he knew how to sell himself. He bragged to other surgeons that he was the best in the business, which immediately raised suspicion. Neurosurgeons just don't talk like that. Yet he charmed the bosses, built a reputation, and marketed himself so well that he had a long list of patients waiting to be seen. He left a childhood friend a quadriplegic after a botched neck operation. He nicked vertebral arteries, triggering strokes. He crippled a woman by driving screws into her spine. By the end, 31 patients were maimed or permanently disabled. Other neurosurgeons would later say Duntsch had no conscience and that it was inconceivable that he had ever been allowed anywhere near a scalpel. In 2017, justice caught up with him. He was sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole in 2045. Hospitals have overlooked maniacs before, and they will do it again. Duntsch was a monster, but he wasn't the worst. Number 8. In June 1975, a New York Times editor received an anonymous, ominous letter. It claimed that a chief surgeon at an American hospital was secretly killing patients, as many as 40. But without names and with no hard proof, the truth was difficult to untangle. The reporter enlisted the help of a forensic toxicologist, and together they looked for hospitals where clusters of unusual deaths had occurred. Their investigation pointed to Riverdale Hospital in Oradell, New Jersey, an 80-bed private clinic. There, the reporter uncovered at least 13 suspicious deaths. The chief surgeon was Mario Jaskalovich, an Argentine immigrant who had joined Riverdale in 1962. And when investigators searched his locker, they found his tools of the trade: 18 mostly empty bottles of curare, a terrifying poison. Curare paralyzes the body, leaving you unable to move or breathe, while your mind stays fully aware, and then your heart gives out. The reporter began to publish the story, but without a conviction, he couldn't name Jaskalovich outright, so the press gave him another name: Dr. X. The Bergen County prosecutor launched an investigation but eventually dropped it. A decade later, in 1976, the case resurfaced. Jaskalovich was charged with 5 murders linked to curare, but the trial was chaotic. The journalist himself was even jailed for contempt after refusing to hand over his notes, but was later pardoned by the governor. In the end, Jaskalovich was acquitted, but he wasn't free. Authorities stripped him of his medical license for gross malpractice, gross negligence, and failure of good moral character. He returned to Argentina in disgrace and died aged just 57 in 1984. But what if the doctor of death thinks he is doing the right thing? Number 7. When you become a doctor or a nurse, you swear to a code of ethics. For doctors, it's the Hippocratic Oath. First and foremost, do no harm. But sometimes there's a gray area. In June 1990, a woman named Janet Adkins died in the back of a rusty old Volkswagen camper van. She slipped quietly into death without ever feeling pain. By her side was Dr. Jack Kevorkian. Kevorkian hadn't really murdered her, he just helped her die. Adkins was only 54 but had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She was losing her memory and begged not to spend her remaining years trapped in a world of confusion. Kevorkian granted her request. He used a contraption that he'd built himself, first called the Thanatron, later the Mercy Machine. The setup was simple. The patient pushed the first button, releasing sodium pentothal, a powerful anesthetic that knocked them unconscious. And then, after a timed delay, a second injection delivered the coup de grace, potassium chloride, stopping the heart almost instantly. It was effectively a lethal injection. The state can do that, but doctors, well, they're not supposed to have that much power. For some, his killing was compassion, a dignified end free from suffering. For others, it was murder. Critics called Kevorkian a Nazi, invoking the memory of Hitler's euthanasia programs. The media branded him Dr. Death. He never once apologized. He said that he was on the side of mercy, not a murderer. But after more than 130 patients used his Mercy Machine, the law could no longer stand by. Men, it was said, do not have the right to play God. In 1998, he was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison. He only served 8. Whether you see him as a monster or a martyr depends on your view of life, death, and dignity. But one thing is certain, with the next doctor we're about to meet, mercy had nothing to do with it. Number 6. In 1952, a famous doctor promised a revolutionary treatment, one that could turn wayward teens into obedient children, the apple of their mother's eye. But unlike other doctors, he worked out of the back of a van. The procedure took only minutes, and it left his patients as zombies, unable to think straight. This doctor, Walter Jackson Freeman II, MD, PhD, took just a few minutes to operate on the patients. He used an ice pick to target parts of the patient that he claimed were responsible for bad behavior. The surgery, called a transorbital lobotomy, was all the rage in the 50s. In 52, he performed 228 of them in just a 2-week period in West Virginia. It was state-sponsored, dubbed Operation Ice Pick in the media. He performed about 3,500 of them in total, not all as part of his roadshow in his lobotomobile, but also in mental institutions. 19 of his patients were minors, one was just 4. Most famously, he operated on 12-year-old Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future U.S. President John F. Kennedy. She was left with devastating mental and physical disabilities. It's believed that as many as 450 died soon after the procedure. Some of his patients' symptoms did improve, and by improving it often meant depression was replaced with a loss of personality. But the majority got worse. Some were turned into walking zombies, having to learn to eat and go to the bathroom again. He was eventually discredited, but it took a long time for the world to call his lobotomies, quote, one of the most barbaric mistakes of modern medicine. Now, if we're talking body count, this next person is up there with the worst of them. Number 5. In 2003, a nurse sat in the witness box at his murder trial, describing how he injected drugs into a patient's arm. When asked about his intention, he calmly replied, "To cause death." Okay, this is a list of the worst doctors in history, but we have to make room for at least one nurse, because Charles Cullen was, without a doubt, the worst of them all. Cullen's life was a long spiral of dark traumas. Growing up in New Jersey in the 60s and 70s, he endured relentless bullying and abuse. He joined the U.S. Navy, hoping for escape, but he couldn't escape the physical and verbal abuse. Vulnerable and unstable, he was a chronic self-harmer, and he would be all his life. He got married, but the relationship soon fell apart. His wife described him as insane, spiking people's drinks with lighter fluid and burning his daughter's school books. When she filed for a restraining order, she warned he needs help. He never got it. Instead, he became a nurse. And in the late 1980s, he discovered a kind of power he had never had before. He began playing God. His method was simple: lethal overdoses of hospital drugs, most often digoxin, sometimes insulin. He even killed 2 patients in a single day. Suspicions were often raised, but they never seemed to stick. In one case, the son of a victim complained that his mother had been healthy, that someone must have murdered her. Cullen was a suspect, but passed a lie detector test. At another hospital, he was caught entering a patient's room with a handful of syringes that he didn't need. A patient's arm was broken in an altercation. Cullen was fired, but he quickly was hired somewhere else. In those days, the U.S. had a nurse shortage, so he could easily move from hospital to hospital. And so it continued. He became a shadowy figure skulking through wards on the night shift. He would slip into rooms he had no right to enter or request drugs he didn't need. Colleagues whispered amongst themselves and supervisors suspected him, but hospitals quietly let him go rather than risk scandal. Time and time again, he landed another job, and time again, patients died. Finally, in October 2003, his last hospital had had enough. They fired him, officially for lying on his job application, but in truth, it's because investigators were closing in. Weeks later, Cullen confessed. He'd admitted to killing at least 40 patients. Authorities confirmed 29. Detectives believe the real number could be as high as 400, making him perhaps the most prolific serial killer in history. Cullen insisted he was an angel of death, sparing the terminally ill from pain. But many of his victims were not terminal. Some had every chance of recovery. Others were only moderately ill. His claim was a lie he told himself. Today, Charles Cullen is still alive, serving 18 consecutive life sentences, and unlike Jack Kevorkian before him, there is little debate about whether he was helping or harming. Cullen wasn't merciful, he was mad. And now for perhaps the strangest story on this list. Number 4. Linda Hazzard didn't just have patients, she had a license to kill. Literally. In Washington in the early 1900s, you could still get a medical license without a medical degree. That's how Hazzard, an alternative healer, set up shop. Her big idea was fasting. She believed fasting, combined with the occasional enema, could cure just about anything. She even wrote books about it. Heart problems? Starve. Cancer? Starve. Alcoholic? No problem. Starve. She opened a sanitarium where patients were put on her regime of treatment. Sometimes nothing but a spoonful of fruit juice in a day for weeks or even months. Desperate people came. Remember, this was an era with no antibiotics, no chemotherapy, no real cures for cancer or organ damage. So when they read Hazzard's promises, all nervous diseases, liquor habit, vices, even a painless childbirth, they clung to the hope that she could help. The place earned a nickname whispered by the locals, Starvation Heights. And sure, fasting can have its benefits, but literally starving sick and fragile patients was a death sentence. At least 15 people are known to have died under her care. The real number may have been much higher. Eventually, the law caught up. She was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 2 years. After prison, she left for New Zealand, but soon returned to Washington to open a new health school. This time, she didn't bother with the license. The school burned down in 1935. 3 years later, she died. Fasting. And now we move from one quack with a license to kill to what was called the murder trial of the century. Number 3. John Bodkin Adams, an Irishman practicing medicine in England, was accused of murdering dozens of patients. But like other cases on this list, it wasn't cut and dried. He worked in hospitals before borrowing money from a patient to buy an 18-room house in the quiet coastal town of Eastbourne. There, he mainly treated the elderly, often women, and curiously many of them left him generous gifts in their wills. He seemed to come into money with suspicious regularity, and it didn't go unnoticed. Newspapers ran stories of the doctor who drove around in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. They said that he was the richest doctor in England. People said that he'd been giving patients unnecessary injections of morphine, speeding up their deaths, but others argued his wealth came simply from his elite clientele, business magnates, sports stars, even nobility. Then, in 1956, a woman named Gertrude Hullett died suddenly under his care. A friend insisted on a second post-mortem, which revealed barbiturate poisoning. After years of rumors, the police finally moved in. Investigators examined 310 death certificates signed by Adams. Astonishingly, 42% listed cerebral thrombosis or cerebral hemorrhage, far above the norm. Many of his patients had slipped into unexplained comas. Nurses told the police that they had seen Adams giving special injections. Was Adams quietly killing off those who had promised him their fortunes? The police thought so. The trial that followed was long and murky. In one case, it was claimed that he injected an elderly lady after saying, "It'll be over in 3 minutes." And it was. But when her body was exhumed, toxicology tests revealed no foul play. In the end, he was acquitted of murder. He was, however, banned from prescribing dangerous drugs, a black mark that later saw his visa to the U.S. denied. Even so, he was reinstated as a general practitioner in 1961, working until his own death in 1983 after fracturing his hip on a shooting trip. He left behind a will worth almost £403,000, about $1.86 million today. Was he a greedy mercy killer, easing the dying into oblivion while lining his pockets? Or simply an eccentric doctor caught up in rumor and scandal? We'll never know for sure, but it is possible that he could have been one of the most prolific serial killers in history. But now, we come to the last two on our list, the worst of the bunch. Number 2. When the prosecutor in this next case was asked what motivated the man on trial, he didn't mince his words. He said he liked to kill people. That man was Dr. Michael Swango, class valedictorian, former U.S. Marine, and a seemingly brilliant medical student. On paper, he was the kind of golden boy every hospital wanted. In reality, he was something far darker, an intelligent but deeply disturbed man obsessed with blood, poisons, and death. When investigators eventually got a hold of his private journals in the 1990s, they found page after page filled with morbid ramblings. There were violent fantasies, obsessions with killing, and a fascination with books like The Torture Doctor about the Nazi killer Joseph Mengele. His notes suggested murder for him was a power trip he was addicted to. In the 1980s, while working as an intern at Ohio State University Medical Center, nurses repeatedly complained that patients would suddenly collapse after Swango had treated them. One nurse said she caught him red-handed, tampering with the IV line, but the complaints were brushed aside as nurse paranoia, administrators not wanting to cause a scandal. Meanwhile, Swango moonlighted as an EMT. Paramedics noticed his very bizarre behavior. More than once, he brewed coffee for his coworkers, and soon after, several of them would be violently ill. The distrust turned out to be well-founded. When police searched him, they found arsenic in his pockets. In 1985, he was convicted of aggravated battery for poisoning his colleagues with arsenic-laced food and drinks. A search of his apartment revealed what police described as a mini laboratory of poisons, complete with handwritten recipes for cyanide, ricin, and even botulism. He served a stint in prison, and for most people that would have ended any career in medicine. Not for Swango. Once released, he reinvented himself. He falsified CVs, forged documents, and legally changed his name to Daniel J. Adams. Soon he was back in white coats and hospitals. His girlfriend at the time frequently suffered mysterious migraines. After she left him, the migraines disappeared, until she was later found dead, arsenic in her system. Almost certainly Swango was to blame, but he carried on as if nothing had happened. By the early 1990s, he was again employed at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York. And again, patients who should have recovered mysteriously died. He seemed like a walking plague. But then the mother of his deceased girlfriend contacted the hospital directly, demanding to know how a man with his record had ever been hired. Administrators were stunned. They hadn't known a thing. Swango was immediately fired, and letters went out to 125 medical schools and more than 1,000 teaching hospitals, warning them not to employ him. But Swango was slippery. He vanished. The FBI tracked his movements, alerting a company in Atlanta where he briefly worked as a chemist, where he was promptly fired. By 1994, he was in Zimbabwe, working at a rural hospital, and once again patients who had been stable or recovering suddenly died. He was suspended, but because toxicology testing was limited and cause of death was hard to prove, he escaped prosecution. He drifted through southern Africa, finding new jobs wherever paperwork could be forged. In one hospital, he was seen wandering the ICU at night when he wasn't even scheduled to work. Soon, patients were dead. A landlady who rented him a room collapsed with arsenic poisoning, but miraculously survived. By now, the net was closing in. He fled again, this time trying to land a gig in Saudi Arabia, but his luck finally ran out. In 1997, during a layover at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, FBI agents were waiting. He was arrested on federal charges of fraud and eventually, after a long investigation, linked to a string of suspicious deaths. How many did he kill? No one knows for sure. At least 60 people are suspected, patients, co-workers, even casual acquaintances. Some investigators believe that number could be much higher. He was a man obsessed with death, intoxicated by the idea of playing God. In prison, Swango stood out for another reason. He's one of the very few inmates in U.S. history who actually requested to be transferred to the country's most notorious supermax facility, ADX Florence in Colorado. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it's a place where silence and isolation drive prisoners completely insane, and Swango asked to go there. He had been stabbed in a regular prison and preferred the loneliness of a concrete tomb to the threat of another prison shiv, and that is where he sits today. And now, the last story, the Dr. Death who puts all the others to shame. Number 1. In the 1960s, Harold Shipman was a boy growing up on a rough council estate in the East Midlands of England. At 17, his mother died of cancer, a tragic event that scarred him for life. Toward the end, her pain was eased only when a doctor injected her with morphine. Shipman, watching this as a teenager, saw firsthand the power of the needle. It was as though the doctor held the keys to life and death. By all appearances, though, Harold, known later as Fred to some, was a good kid. He studied hard, earned a place at Leeds University Medical School, and married young. He and his wife went on to have 4 children. For a lad from a working-class background, he'd won the life lottery. But all was not well in the mind of Harold Shipman. In 1974, he took a post as a general practitioner in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, a gray little town of mills and moors. It was the kind of place TV shows were made about local respectable doctors. But behind that respectable exterior, cracks started to show. In 1975, he was arrested for abusing pethidine, a synthetic opioid that he had been injecting himself with. Sent to a rehabilitation clinic, he was patched up and allowed to continue practicing medicine. By the 1980s and early 90s, he was back in business, this time in Manchester, where locals considered him not just a good doctor, but a pillar of the community. He was the sort of man people trusted instantly, someone you would happily stop in the street to chat with, someone who always seemed to have time for the sick and the elderly. By 1992, he had set up his own practice after falling out with his partner. His waiting room was always full of pensioners, worn down with joint issues after hard lives spent working in factories and textile mills. But one of his colleagues noticed something odd. A lot of Shipman's patients were dying, too many and too suddenly. An investigation was carried out, but no wrongdoing was found. Shipman's clean reputation and reassuring manner shielded him from public contempt. How could anyone accuse the nice Dr. Shipman? Then, in 1998, an 81-year-old former mayoress named Kathleen Grundy died under his care. She was well-liked, in good health, certainly not at death's door, and stranger still, she left nearly her entire estate, worth the equivalent of about $1 million today, to her Dr. Harold Shipman. Her children were astonished, and when the document was examined, the signature was found to be a blatant forgery. Maybe Dr. Shipman wasn't as nice as he looked. This opened the floodgates to an investigation and exhumations. Detectives discovered a disturbing pattern. Shipman had been killing his elderly patients with lethal doses of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin, and then covering his tracks with falsified records. At first, 15 deaths were confirmed, but when a full public inquiry was launched, the numbers ballooned into something that shocked the entire world. Shipman was found responsible for 215 murders, with suspicions of up to 45 more. That made him, by most counts, the most prolific serial killer in modern history. What drove him to kill? We may never know. Maybe it was rooted in that early trauma, watching his mother's pain relieved by morphine, seeing the godlike control a doctor wielded over life and death. Whatever the reason, Harold Shipman, the quiet GP with the reassuring smile, was the deadliest of them all. In 2000, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Whole life, the judge said, meaning that he would never leave prison alive. And he didn't. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison. History has seen true evil disguised as medicine, especially during World War II. Watch the Nazi psycho doctor Joseph Mengele to uncover the twisted experiments that still shock the world today. Or click on this video instead.